All right, I can see people joining in. Feel free to start sharing your slides, Paul.
Okay.
While you get the slides set up, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amin Mahina. I'm the Member Services Coordinator at the Municipal Engineers Association. And today we're glad to present to you on the Municipal Class EA process fall update. Paul Knowles is our presenter today, our speaker today. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Paul. He is our advisor on Municipal Class EA. He has been involved with many iterations of the document and review and publication of it. And he is our instructor for the Introduction to MCEA workshop course. Paul was the CEO of Carleton Place. He held positions in engineering prior to that. He participated in the Municipal Engineers Association. He was the president of the association in 2017 and was a board member from 2008 to 2018. Without further ado, welcome Paul, and welcome to everyone. You can go ahead, Paul.
Okay, welcome everybody. Nice to, I guess I'm not seeing you, but I guess we'll interact with each other this afternoon. Hope everybody, at least in my area, we had lots of lightning and thunder last night, so maybe everybody had that. We've been fielding lots of calls recently from different people around the province of regarding the Class EA, and in particular the amendment. But so we thought we should just do a little update this afternoon and try and, well, at least share, although we don't have all the answers, at least share with you the status of where things are right now, just so it's clear. So we'll talk about the amendment to the Class EA this afternoon. We'll talk a little bit about the Part 2 order, the new Part 2 order request process, that new process that's been in place for about a year. Give you a little update on the plans for a regulation that will replace the Class EA at some point in time. Another issue we've been dealing with is air quality assessments or air quality impact assessments. And then we'll talk about what training is going to come up. What are we planning for the future? So jumping right in, EA reform. This is, as many of you probably know, the Municipal Engineers Association and others, we've had lots of support, have been encouraging some EA reform for many years. And our real goals have been to reorganize the projects in schedules. And then it's been a real problem, this Part 2 order request process and how it operated in the past has been an ongoing issue for many years. And we, even though we've been at it many years, we really got very little progress until after the last election, and then in April of 19, the government released discussion papers, and there was two of them. One talked about the short-term fixes, immediate fixes, dealt with exempting low-risk projects and timelines for Part 2 order requests, and these were certainly topics that were priority for us. And then the other one that frankly wasn't as much priority, but the government had a discussion paper and talked about modernizing the EA program. So that those discussion papers in April were followed very quickly by actual legislation in June of 19, More Homes, More Choice Act. And it actually did reduce the number of projects that were eligible. It made sure that Schedule A and A plus projects were exempted from the Part 2 order request process. And then it scoped the limits of the Part 2 order review. So we talked about making improvements. And we had always been pushing for it to be delegated, the decision to be delegated and prompt, and there'd be prompt decisions. And all they really talked about was that there would be a deadline, but they didn't say what. So the legislation just allowed some action, but we had to wait and see what would happen. So some stuff happened fairly quickly in June of 19. And another thing that happened is the ministry approached us and all the other Class A holders. It wasn't just municipal engineers. They were looking at modernizing all of the Class A's, and they encouraged all of the Class A holders in June to submit an amendment to the Class A. And we have been sort of looking for this for quite some time, so we were had some real thoughts already on what we wanted to amend, so we were very encouraged. And the amendments, they said they wanted them by September, the end of September of 19. So we submitted our amendment by just before the end of 2019, the end of September 2019, we got our amendment submitted. And admit we thought optimistically that we get it in, and judging by how quickly things have moved from April to June and then September, we thought, great, we'll have a little consultation, 45 days or something, and we'll have it approved before Christmas, and that'll be our Christmas present in 2019. Well, it didn't quite work that way. We submitted our stuff. We had a few comments back during the winter, and then of course COVID came along. So between government review and COVID, nothing much happened until July of 2020. So in July of 2020, we actually posted our amendment for comment. So it took almost a year before they even took our amendment and posted it for comment to available from the stakeholders. And at the same time, in July of 2020, they introduced the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Act. So there was this flurry of activity. And in that act, it did two things related to the Class EA. It really significantly altered this Part 2 order request process and said it was only available for Aboriginal or treaty rights. If it didn't involve the Aboriginal or treaty rights, it wasn't accepted as a Part 2 order request, so the ministry would not deal with it. And then this act also set up the legislative framework to allow the ministry to introduce new regulations that are to replace the municipal Class A and all Class A's. So, so this all happened in July of 2020, and there was some posting on of our amendment. The first deadline was the end of August, and then for Indigenous groups, it got extended into the end of September. So anyway, so again, in September we had comments, and we thought, well, we'll quickly move through the approval process now. But of course, we're now September of 2021, and it's still not approved. So what has been happening since then is a valid question. And there's a few things. Based on the comments, there's going to be some revisions to our amendment. There were significant comments. Most of I'll talk about that later. We'll skip to the other two first. The other thing that's happening and continues to happen is Indigenous consultation. And then in the background of all this, there's so many changes to the physical document that we've been working to prepare an actually brand new document. It's just kind of easier to, and change the format's slightly different. This is just instead of trying to incorporate a whole bunch of amendments, we're looking at actually producing a brand new document. So the Indigenous consultation, where that stands is we've discovered, or what came out of the consultation is that Indigenous groups were quite concerned about the gap that gets created when a Schedule B or C project so this is particular to us, they have concerns in other things. In our municipal class, we're proposing to shift a number of projects from Schedule B or C into Schedule A plus because we feel they're fairly routine. But what that does is the Indigenous groups are highlighting to us that they rely on the notices that go out as part of the Schedule B or C process to trigger their involvement, and in particular to trigger a look at impacts to archaeological resources and burial sites. So that's a valid concern, just because the reasons we were seeing it, the Schedule B and C, as unnecessary. We weren't trying to downplay that it was unnecessary to check about burial sites, for example. That's still necessary. So MEA's proposal is that there be a screening process, or sorry, not MEA's, the ministry's proposal to this, back to these Indigenous groups, is there would be a screening process so that one of our ones we want to shift is a pumping station. So you want to build a pumping station, and instead of going from B to A plus, it would, first of all, you'd have to screen it to look at potential or known archaeological resources. You'd have to look at archaeological assessments and what are those impacts and what are the mitigations. It would be this checklist the ministry would have, the proponent would have to follow. And after you followed that, and you could successfully work through that checklist, then it would become a Schedule A plus project. So it addresses this gap. So the ministry has sent their proposed solution or to this, addressing their concerns, back to the Indigenous groups for input, and they asked for it first by the beginning of August, and they extended that to the end of August. So that's just a couple of weeks ago. So they still are working to get that result. So we haven't heard the final outcome of all of that, but the ministry is working on that. So that's something that has, you wonder what's taken time since September of 2020. This is one thing that's taken time and is still kind of one of the last things that needs to get wrapped up before our amendment can be approved. I mentioned we're looking at preparing a new manual, so it'll look a little different. The type is going to be a little different format. And what we'll do is we'll produce a clean version for the ministry's approval. And what I mean by a clean version is, I'll show you the next slide here. What we want to do is actually incorporate our companion guide. So right now we've been issuing as a separate document a companion guide that gives you helpful information or tips on how to proceed through various sections. And what we want to do is actually incorporate that right in the document. Now, so you can see the blue text boxes here. We produce a version without these boxes in it, and that's what the minister would actually approve. Then we would add these, because these aren't minister approved, this is the municipal engineer's advice to proponents. And I guess there's an advantage that way, that that advice can change over time depending what's going on, and we're free to make those changes without going back to the ministry for an amendment. So we want to keep it separated, but we also want it easy for proponents to see. So you can say, we built in just exercise caution when committing to detailed design in ASRs. This limits options during detailed design. So that's just a little bit of advice. The next one here is about air quality, and it's a fairly long advice, and instead of trying to incorporate right there, it'll be a reference to, basically at the back of the book, there'll be an appendix or an attachment that has where you would look for that. So you would turn there and you would see this reference and a whole discussion, and that's actually something we're going to talk about just at the end of the webinar. So what are we waiting on for this VA reform and the amendment to get approved? Well, ultimately we need the minister's approval, and before that's going to happen, the Indigenous consultation needs to be completed, and then I guess it needs to work into the government timetable for making and announcing decisions, and so that's why there's question marks on the date. Now we want to be in a position, we hope this happens soon, but we've been hoping that for a couple of years. And then we want to be in a position that very shortly thereafter, we want to be ready to be able to publish this new document sort of very shortly after the minister approves it. Of course, we can't finalize it because we don't know what the minister is going to approve, but we're trying to be prepared. And the same thing about incorporating the guide into the manual. Again, we don't know what's going to be approved, so we can't finalize the guide, but we want to be all prepped up and ready to go. So that's the status of that stuff. And just about the revisions to the amendment. So we did have, I'd say, very significant interest. We had 288 comments that came from municipalities, consultants, stakeholders, Indigenous groups, associations, mounted to 147 pages. Many of the comments were supportive, so there's high interest in seeing this amendment approved. There were some helpful suggestions for improvements that we've tried. That's some of the stuff we want to change, is issues that people raised, the proponents pointed out that should be included, and that was very helpful. And there were some concerns raised by some groups, and tried to address those either in the response to the comments or in a revision to the amendment. So some of the things we're looking at, there's some of them are pretty minor, but one is this got raised to us, that when you're doing a planning approvals of roads under the Planning Act, and it's the local roads, or the amendment talks about a way you can use the Planning Act to address collector and arterial. Well, local road, so you're building a subdivision, and the subdivision may have a small bridge within the subdivision. So all of a sudden, you're doing Class A for a bridge that's within a local road system inside a subdivision that's had all this planning done around it. So we want to add what's in red here: construction of local roads, and any bridges located on these local roads. So the bridge and the road needs to go together. So that's a helpful suggestion that came from several different proponents, actually. Another one with bridges is we found a lot of confusion when through. We have structures called the structures of grade separations, interchanges, water crossings, overpasses. We use a whole bunch of different terms, but what we really mean is bridges. And we looked at the CSA standard for bridges actually has a definition, and they use the term bridge. So we're just going to go through the document, take out all those other terms and put in bridge and define a bridge. This actually comes out of the CSA basically. So any of these types of structures that's over 30 meters. There's a term in our amendment called environmentally sensitive area, and we've got some feedback on what it should be, a better definition. And again, these aren't settled yet. These are the topics that we feel are going to be amended in some fashion, and we need to finalize all these details before there's an improvement. Another one is a municipal servicing site. We had created this kind of new term, and then we got asked some comments were, well, what is it? We ended up deciding that we just deleted the term. We should take it out and just alter the words with it, just describe it in the wording of the item in Schedule 1. So really, we don't think we need that term we had thought we would create. We're adding in some terms that just weren't in the previous document and really have always been considered Schedule A+, but we're just clarifying and putting them in. This is one where we've run into a problem with the ministry interpreting building a small apartment building in a rural area where there's no servicing, and they drill a well and want to service their apartment building, and the ministry is calling it a new water service, and they need to do a Schedule C Class EA for a well to service an apartment building on private property. So we feel this is an important thing to get included in the definition. We tinkered with the wording a bit about the municipal bridge checklist, but I don't think the intent has changed at all. This is an issue that got brought up, that if you're removing a bridge, you're retiring a road, and part of that retirement is removing a bridge, then you really need to look at the heritage aspect of that bridge as well. So use the checklist. And if you're attaching a wastewater or water pipe attached to the bridge, and you need to confirm whether it's a heritage bridge and you're interfering with the heritage aspects of it by attaching to the bridge. Here, a couple of things. We talk in 8.3.5.3 about public notices and how you don't have to follow that standard of 2 ads in the local paper. You can advertise in other ways, and we talk about it being authorized by a municipal bylaw, and we wanted more flexibility because some people don't use bylaws, just a municipal standard procedure. And then something we want to highlight is that stakeholders and specifically Indigenous communities need to be consulted when you're developing a new notification process. So if you've always relied, the Indigenous community has always watched the newspaper for ads, and all of a sudden you decide you're going to advertise in some other fashion, you need to have consulted with them and made them aware that there's going to be a new place to look for these notices. It's just a little detail of clarifying that equalization tanks include for sanitary. If it's an equalization for stormwater, it really doesn't fall in this category. Again, this is just clarifying the details around detention ponds and detention tanks. That they're for sanitary or combined, not for storm. This sets out the LID, low impact design features. If you need property for them, it would trigger a Schedule D, and that's kind of consistent with other features or other elements that it triggers a Schedule D if you need property. And here's the difference on adding active and passive into the treatment process. That is the difference between a Schedule A+ and a Schedule C. And then, of course, there were changes to the Part 2 order request process and the amending process. These the ministry supplied the wording there. We're going to talk about that shortly. So that's those are a revision to what, those are some of the key revisions that we feel will be made to the amendment that we submitted. So many that you would have seen the amendment in September of 2020, and should expect those kind of revisions to the amendment when it's approved, we hope. So maybe we'll pause there and see if anybody has any questions on anything about the amendment. And I guess I told you as much as I know, but try and answer any questions on that. And then do we have lots of people, or what's the, how should people submit questions?
We have quite a large audience here. We were anticipating quite a few so that we can allow a live discussion with voice, but since the audience is a crowd, so we'll just take the typed typed questions instead. So there you go. The first question, Paul. A great idea on including the companion guide. They're just wondering if there will continue to be a standalone companion guide document as well.
We're kind of thinking it would just be built into the Class EA document, whether that's on you're doing it online or on paper. That it would be possible to create it, but that's not our thoughts. It's just then you don't have to be flipping back and forth between two documents. It would all be in one.
The second question is more specific. We are about to start an AEA project that would be a Schedule C based on the existing process and will likely be lower schedule from B to A plus to B to either B to or A plus if the proposed amendment is approved. How should we proceed with this project during the transition?
Well, there is a phase in, and I guess if you started it as a C and you get a month after you start, it becomes an A plus. You I guess would have the choice of proceeding as a C, and that's you can choose that, or you can choose to agree that in this particular instance the A plus is sufficient, and you simply advertise that hey, the legislation. You tell those people that you issued the notice of commencement to that it's no longer necessary to follow through this process, and instead we'll be following the Schedule A plus because that's what the legislation is now, and then follow the A plus.
And has the revised Bridge Heritage checklist been approved yet?
Well, we feel it's completed, but they don't want it. It needs the amendment approved before it can be implemented. So it's kind of sitting there waiting on the amendment because they do all tie. They both tie together.
Thanks, Paul. And there's I see quite a few questions asking about the slides and the recording. So the slides deck will be shared with participants. The recording will be made public as well, and we'll share the link with everyone. So that if you missed something that you would like it to be repeated, just wait until the recording is available, and you'll be able to view any part of the presentation on your own time. Is there room for another question, Paul?
Oh, sure. One more, and then let's push on. We'll cover the next topic.
Okay. The question is more into as a comment and a question at the same time. It says, so you are expecting to prepare a new MCEA class document in the interim while we wait for the new MCEA streamlined process from the ministry in the longer term?
Yeah, I guess the answer is yes. We do. The ministry has encouraged us. We discussed this back in June of 2019, when they kind of encouraged us to file the amendment, but they still, even at that time, were saying there's going to be further changes. So they keeps telling us that the changes are going to happen soon. what the definition of soon, I think, is not my definition of soon. So yes, the ministry has encouraged, and we certainly agree that it's important to get this amendment addressed and get this done. And after that, focus our efforts on the regulation. We'll talk more about that in another section of this presentation.
Right. Thanks, Paul. We'll take the rest of the questions in the next question period.
Okay, so let's talk about this new Part 2 order request process. And, you know, in history, it was it started off being known as bump ups, and it kind of morphed into being called the Part 2 order request. And actually, the ministry says now it's supposed to be called a request for Section 16 order. And I put in red here, it's really this issue of dealing with unresolved concerns. So there's request for Part 16 order. The legislation now says it's restricted to a concern that's adverse impacts on constitutionally protected Aboriginal treaty rights. If it doesn't involve that, it's not part of this process. It's not part of the Part 2 order request or the Section 16 order process. But that's why the title of unresolved concerns, there are going to be other unresolved concerns, and how do they get dealt with? So the legislation refers them to the proponent. Now there's also a separate opportunity for the ministry, and in particular the minister, on their own initiative to consider projects. So let's get into this, how it actually works. That gets a little complicated. So in very quick terms here, you've got the proponent distributes the notice of commencement. Proponent completes the Class EA process with the required studies, the consultation, selects the preferred solutions to go through that whole process. And at the end of it all, the proponent issues a notice of completion, and there's a 30-day review period. So we'll call this days 1 to 30. So what happens? So that nothing's changed in any of that. So what happens after that? Well, this happens, and you can see this is a little complicated. I'll try and walk you through, and I'm going to go fairly quickly at the bottom part, but we'll walk through this. So the first thing is the notice of completion. This is the mandatory wording that you need to include in your notice. So whereas in the past, the notice has talked about forward your requests or your concerns to the ministry, it says, you know, very clearly in here, interested persons may provide written comments to our project team. All comments and concerns are sent directly to the proponent and the address. So if there's a concern during those 30 days, it doesn't go to the ministry, it goes to the proponent. The ministry receives it, I guess, you know, by mistake. If people are following the old system, I understand the ministry is supposed to simply forward that on to the proponent for action. Now, in addition, and this is where if it's they are allowed to go to the ministry if it refers to an Aboriginal or treaty right. So those are the wording, and that's of course a very significant change. That concerns do not go to the ministry unless they involve Aboriginal or treaty rights. So what can happen here? So there's really three things can happen during this 30-day period. You could get no concerns submitted whatsoever on any topic. It's great. So that's the yellow box. You could get concerns that are submitted to the proponent in 30 days. So that's the purple box. And then the blue box there, concerns that do relate to a treaty, Aboriginal or treaty right. This is a Section 16 order process, so Part 2 order. So that one does go to the ministry. Purple ones go to the municipality. The yellow there really is no concerns, of course. So if there's a concern comes in about the Aboriginal or treaty rights, the use of we had we had worked with the ministry and introduced a form, a part to order request form. Well, that form has been discontinued because it's really not relevant anymore. Instead, the proponent or the requester sends their concerns in writing in some fashion, and whatever fashion they choose, onto the minister. And the ministry will then contact the proponent and meet with the proponent and have to work through and address those concerns. And there seems to be there's really no guidance on how that's going to happen. So yeah, the proponent works with the ministry project, and the project can't proceed until there's a decision issued. And there's really no timelines. Is, I guess, a little concerning, but I can also understand why there's no fixed process and no fixed deadline, because it's so variable what could happen during the Indigenous, working with about an Indigenous concern. So if concerns come into municipalities, the proponent needs to review them and respond to them. You need to document the concerns and the responses, and you should have them available for the ministry if the ministry requests to see them. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, those concerns and responses, we would encourage the use of a form. So the ministry had regulated the use of a form for the Part 2 orders. So there's no regulation insisting that the form be used, but we think it'd be wise to, it would help guide the stakeholder when they're writing to you on what is really legitimate. So we produced a form that we suggest you use. But what the proponents need to do and should do in advance of these projects, every proponent should develop a process to review these concerns. This, you issue your notice of completion, and on day 10 you got a concern raised. Well, what are you going to do with that? Who's going to respond to it? Who's going to review it? You need to know what process you're going to use. So you strongly recommend you give that thought beforehand, not try and figure it out at the time. So you need to decide who will respond, and then whoever does respond, it would be great if you referred to how this concern that got raised hopefully isn't brand new. So you can point to your ESR or your study documentation, say, well, yes, this was considered, and this is how it's being addressed, and you can explain that this is the mitigation we propose. If it raises something and you feel, I think a common one is something comes up that it's really a detailed design issue. So I'll say you can make a commitment to examine that during detailed design, for example. And we would really encourage proponents to respond in a timely manner to this, although there is legislative deadline. And we think it'd be great, you should make your response a complete package, because at some point the ministry may come along and ask to see it. So keep that in mind, that if this is a stakeholder that you've already corresponded to a couple of times, there's been issues raised and you've already responded, and this is the third time they've raised it and you're responding yet again, keep a nice little package all together of it's raised, response, here's how we dealt with it. Keep that as a nice little package that if the ministry asks to see it, you can just pull it out and have it available. So this is the form, and we're going to make this available on the MCEA website. Just talks through the paragraph, and it follows more or less the format of the previous form that was for the Part 2 orders. So fairly straightforward. So then what? So we've issued the day 1 to 30. You have the notice of completion issued. Put in your 30 days, and hopefully you didn't get any Part section 16 orders. You've gotten any concerns submitted or submitted the proponent and developed your response and responded. Now, if there were no concerns, of course, there's no response. There's nothing to respond. You would just in your file document, this is how we advertise. We didn't get any concerns, and that's noted in our file. And if the ministry ever asks, you can pull it out and say, yes, this is the dates on this when this happened, and we didn't receive any concerns. So whichever of these categories you're in, or you could be in both, you could have both a section 16 order or have other concerns. You could have both things. What's new in this legislation is there's another new 30-day period. So this is from day 31 to 60. And so you need to remember this, is in the past, if you're in the yellow category and you waited 30 days and nothing happened, you just proceeded. Well, that's not true anymore. If there's still 30 more days for the ministry on its own initiative to take action. So what can happen during this second 30-day period? So the ministry can do nothing. So in the ideal world, I guess you've done everything satisfactory. You haven't heard any concerns from anybody. You wait 30 more days, and this is on the far left. Ministry does not issue an order or notice or a letter. Then the project can proceed. So that's your first opportunity. You wait 30 extra days, and then you proceed. Now, during this day 31 to 60, the director may issue what's called a notice, and it'd be a notice to the proponent saying, we're considering an order, and that notice would have further instructions about what they would likely be asking for further information and wanting it within a certain number of days. Or they maybe don't feel they even need any information. The minister has the ability to just strictly issue an order and order you to do something. So that's the most important change and thing to remember, is that this second 30-day period, you need to wait for the 30-day period to go by before you're clear to go. And I'm going to go through what happens if the director issues a notice here, and it gets a little complicated. So, but it isn't critical maybe to follow that all, right at this time, because what will happen is you'll get a letter from the director, and it'll set out the next steps for you. So I'll go through and outline these things, but you would be guided through it by the correspondence you receive. So it's not critical that you know them at this time, because hopefully it doesn't happen. So anyway, in the one instance, the ministry does nothing and you can proceed. In the other instance, the minister issues an order, and that's, I guess, good from a timing perspective, because the order either says, yeah, you can proceed with these conditions. So you have a decision, you can proceed and you just follow the conditions. Or the minister might have ordered you to, you have to complete a comprehensive EA. So you basically go back to the drawing board. So once you remove those two options off the table, go back to this director issuing a notice. So the director can issue a notice, and that starts the clock ticking on a further 30-day period. So this is kind of from day 60 to 90, or 61 to 90. So there's been a notice that you're likely going to get an order, and there's another 30 days for the order to follow. Unless, of course, the notice says, well, we need more information. And if there's more information required, it'll say, send this information within this many days, then you have a deadline. And if you meet that deadline, then you'll get a notice, you'll get receipt back saying, okay, we got it, and now let's start this third 30 days. If you don't, you don't meet the deadline, you'll get a notice of unsatisfactory information, and you need to go back and start from the notice of completion and start all over again. So they can go through, ministry can go through and ask you for more information, and then simply not act. And if you wait those third 30 days, so up to day 90, the minister does not issue an order, then you're free to proceed. And if he doesn't, if they do issue an order, then you can proceed following the order with and meet the conditions if there are any, and or you'd be ordered back to do a comprehensive. So I realize that gets a little confusing, but as I said, you would be guided through that process by the correspondence with the ministry, or you can, if you're really into it, hopefully you don't get into that process, and so you don't need to understand all of those details. But these are the important things: is after that first 30 days, so use the MEA form and review those concerns within the first 30 days, and then wait that second 30 days for the ministry to consider the project, and hopefully they don't act, and therefore you're just free to go. And this is very important, I think. I just got this data. This legislative change came into effect just over a year ago. So this data is from, well, I think it has about 11 months of data. But there was 177 projects that issued notices of completion, and you can see none of them, in no cases did the minister issue a notice or an order. So that's encouraging that the ministry didn't feel it necessary to basically step in on any one, even a single project in the last year. So that's good. And I think this is something that, of course, we will monitor on an ongoing annual basis, because, that kind of, I guess the ministry, it's supposed to be proponent-driven process. And if there's no concerns, or concerns that have been dealt with locally, the minister shouldn't be getting involved. So this is encouraging. So any questions on that topic?
Yeah, there's quite a few, Paul. Thanks for the elaboration. One question is asking the industry has informed us that the first 30-day review period is to be defined as the 30-day comment period. Is that correct in terms of the terminology of it?
Yeah, the first 30-day period is comment period. It's after the notice of completion of 30 days, so it's the same thing.
And is the new S-16 order process in place yet, or should we be following the Part 2 order request until the amendments are approved?
No, this has nothing to do with the amendment to our Class CA. This was approved in the legislation last July, so it is in force and effect now.
Okay.
Yeah, just like obviously our documents, you turn to the Class CA and read the section. It's wrong because the legislation's been changed and the section hasn't, but the legislation overrules.
Mm-hmm. And, is there any potential for the director to issue a project cannot proceed in fewer than 30 days?
Well, yeah, I guess the director would be issuing a notice. So as soon as you get the notice, it'll say, yeah, you can't proceed. And yeah, so if you get a notice, it's either going to say you can't proceed, and then you have to wait 30 more days to see if an order comes, or it's more likely going to say, I would guess, and there hasn't been any, but I would guess if they're going to issue something, they would at least ask you for some information. So they're going to issue a notice of you can't proceed, and we have questions, and we need your response, we need this information from you, and we'll give you 30 days to provide it, whatever it is. You know, they'll give you a timeline to provide it. So you have to stop work, provide the information. Then after they have acknowledged that they have all the information they need, then they have another 30 days to either issue an order, or if they do nothing, then you can proceed.
So what happens in the case that the notice came after the 30 days, if it came later?
Well, the legislation says they can only issue the notice between day 31 and 60. So,
so the project can go on and
yeah.
There's another question. We are increasingly being asked by MCEA to review the draft project file reports and ESR for 30 days before formally filing the EA documentation, although this is a proponent-driven assessment process. Can you comment on this step of MCEA reviewing and accepting?
Well, that's something that it's not really written down in any place it's not a requirement. We are aware, and we've had these comments and we've had discussions. The ministry feels that they are entitled to ask for that if, on projects they feel are complex enough. I personally think, well, they can ask, but doesn't want to do it. There's nothing forcing anybody to, and so we don't have a good resolution on that issue.
Would that change with the new regulation, or would you think it would still be an issue?
I'm guessing it will be an issue forever.
Okay. So those are all the questions that I see so far.
Okay. Well, we might as well. Time's going by here. And let's talk a little bit about this new regulation to replace the Class EA. And I admit, when I first thought about this or heard about this, it was sort of I thought this might not be a good thing, but we'll see. Anyway, the ministry announced this intent, and you know, they're of course not just thinking about the municipal Class A; they're thinking about all of them. And they look and they see a wide variation between the various Class A's and the expectations and how they operate, and they'd like to see some standardization, which I guess makes some sense. It doesn't really involve us per se, but I guess it does involve us if they standardize our process to something else. But and the other fundamental, that's one of the things they want to accomplish. The other thing they want to do is they want to switch the onus around. Right now, the Act requires an environmental assessment, and actually it involves a comprehensive comprehensive environmental assessment of everything that a municipality or a public body does, unless, so it starts off by capturing everything, and then you have to find a way out of a way out of it. There's a number of ways to get out of that. One of the, there's exemptions, there's declaration orders, there's and one of the ways to get out of doing the comprehensive is to have the project identified in a Class EA. They want to turn that all around and say only the projects on this list will be subject to municipal to an EA process. So they've already published a list for the projects they feel should be subject to a comprehensive, which we saw that list and had some comments, but there was nothing surprising about it. It just puts in writing what the current practice is from what we could see. So anyway, their idea is, I guess you would take the list of B's and C projects in our document and list them on this list, and therefore they would be captured as having to follow a process in a regulation, probably that's very similar to the Class EA. And then there would be no list of Schedule A or A plus projects, because if you're not on the list for this B or C or this list, you are exempt. And there are some things, like things do come up that it's hard when you're writing a list of things you want to exempt. It's hard to think about absolutely everything. And so this maybe is an advantage in that fashion. So anyway, they built into the Economic Recovery Act the ability to do these two things, to develop this project list and to develop these regulations. So as I just explained, the list, you're either on the list or you're not. If you're not on the list, you're not subject to your exempt. The other thing is, if it is on the list, if you're building a major road, once you get it defined of what qualifies, then it doesn't matter who the proponent is. Like right now, it's the municipal Class A. These are the municipal projects, and it's MTO and it's other proponents. But I guess they're concerned. One of the comments I've heard is, well, if a municipality builds a wastewater treatment plant, it's captured. But if the industry builds one, it's not. And why shouldn't they be subject to the same regulations? So that has been kind of a comment. Now, the difficulty I see in that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to is if you simply take our list of, right now it says any new road is a Schedule C, so any new road will be subject. But to us, a road is a municipal road. It isn't a piece of pavement with curbs that goes through a park or a waste site. What about a private industry that paves a piece of their property that connects two areas of their property? And is that all of a sudden going to become subject to the regulation? Pumping stations, wells, this whole thing of a well on private property that's servicing even a private house. Well, is that a new, if developing a new well is listed to be subject to the Act, and it should be if it's a new municipal well for a new municipal system. We certainly agree, but a new well for a private house shouldn't be. So you're going to have to be very careful in how you define things. Shoreline, a developer doing some shoreline, or what a private homeowner doing some shoreline work versus a municipal project. I think those are two entirely different things. And it's critical that these definitions are appropriate. So we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to that. So I guess just actually yesterday, there's a group, there's other Class A's, there's MTOs, Conservation Authority, Hydro, I think there's 10 or 12 of them all together. And we meet, a little more often these days, but we meet and discuss issues of common interest. And we just happened to meet yesterday, and we were talking about this because this change to a regulation for Class A affects all of those ministries just as much as it does us. So they have the same concerns or questions. And one of the things we realize, we're a bit unique and a bit maybe ahead of the others. We actually have a regulation. So Ontario Reg 231, which is the TPAP or the transit regulation, so we already have some experience with the regulated process. So this new regulation may not follow exactly what TPAP does, but if it does something like that, so I put up a flow chart of our Class EA and of the TPAP process. And zoom in really here a little bit more on on the regulated process, there's an awful lot of similarities. And, when I first heard about the TPAT process, it sounded great because it was all these fixed deadlines of you put out your notice of commencement, and 120 days later, you have to have your notice of completion, and it moves very quickly. But when you actually get into the detail of it, what it talks about is all these pre-planning activities, and there's a whole list. I won't bother reading them all, but before you start the transit project under the regulated process, you have to do all your studies. You have to basically go right through and do all your studies, do all your consultation, and go see the bottom, right at the bottom, and a second to the bottom, go to municipal council with a draft environmental project report. So it's environmental project report instead of environmental study report. It's a few words differently, but you're not issuing your notice of commencement until you're basically complete. So this idea that it's a fixed time frame, it's a fixed time frame after you've done all the work, which generally takes all the time. So when I compare the two, I think, when I look here and you can see the Class C Schedule C process, you get the notice of commencement, and you have your mandatory public input, and then your notice of completion, and then you have your 2 30-day periods. Well, under the TPAT, you do all that work in advance, then you do your notice of commencement, then you have your final, it's kind of your final consultation with stakeholders, or we would have it after our notice of completion. They kind of do it after the notice of commencement. Then you have your notice of completion, and then you have actually in the TPAP reg, interestingly, it's a 30-day review period for the public and 35 days for the minister. I guess the minister only has 5 less days than the Class A now. And then there's a statement of completion that comes afterwards, even that. So it's a little bit different. But in essence, from the public's perspective, I don't think there's going to be a big change. So the ministry has told us they're going to start working on this new regulation, and they're going to start with the regulation that applies to municipalities, because we are the biggest in terms of the sheer number of projects that happen in the province. There's more municipal Class A's done than probably most of the others combined. So they're going to start with our regulation. They have said they're going to be working on it this fall. We've kind of encouraged them, let's make the priority the amendment and don't put your effort into this. But they did last spring in May send out they had a couple of webinars, gathered input, and asked for a questionnaire to be completed. So we filled in the questionnaire, and you can see the process here: the Schedule C process, the TPAP process, and what we're recommending, and we'll see how this goes, is that we try and pull some of the best pieces from each of the Class CA and the TPAP, and keep some fixed deadlines from the TPAP. Keep, the notice. We think there should be a formal notice early in the process, not unlike TPAP where there's no notice. You just go out and do these things. So we got a suggested new terms like notice of initiation. But so you can see, you do this. We're suggesting there be a notice of initiation. Then you basically do your process of consultation. Then notice of formal consideration would replace the notice of commencement. So this is the formal consideration of what you come up with. Consult again, and then your notice of completion. So that's the suggestion and the feedback we gave the ministry back in May of this year, and we haven't really heard back from them yet on that. So anyway, our best guess is that, and this is a slide, the MCEA follows this general process of identify the problem, we look at the alternatives to the undertaking, look at the alternative methods, assess the impacts, mitigation, preferred solution, and consult. So all of the stuff, we may change the names of some of the notices and change the timing a little bit, but I really think that, the skills or the process for doing it, obtaining the approval, is not likely to radically change, is my best guess. And I think this is just me speculating. And as I said, we're really sort of trying to encourage the ministry to focus their efforts on improving the amendment. And when we get around to this new regulation, just being realistic, I can't imagine things happening before they do an election. And then after an election, how quickly will a new government move on this? Who knows? So again, another opportunity if you have any questions on that topic or anything else. There it is.
All right, thanks, Paul. During the TPAP 30-day public review, comments are submitted to the MECP. So for the MEA, the new regulation, would likely the comments will be submitted directly to the proponent?
Well, I would think so. And that's that. I think the ministry, I assume, gave it a fairly good thought process, and they put it right in the legislation in July last year. So I don't know why they would not stick with what's in the legislation, but I guess we'll see. But I would think that would be the case, yes.
Okay. I just noticed that I missed a couple of questions that were submitted in the chat earlier. I'd just like to remind everyone to just submit your questions in the Q&A so that I can see them better. I'll go back to the questions that were submitted in the chat. Did you consider using the area of natural significance definition from Ontario Regulation 153.04 under EPA instead of the environmentally significant lands definition from the City of Toronto that's proposed?
As I said, that definition went back and forth, and I noticed the reference to Toronto, and I frankly realized that the latest one from the ministry did not have a reference to Toronto. So sorry, my slide isn't up to date with the latest that we've discussed. I'll have to go back and get that out. As I said, all of these things, these are topics that we had discussions with the ministry about. None of them are approved yet, but yeah, that one is, I don't have the latest discussion. I'll check that.
Okay. The next question asks, is there a document that explains the MECP 30-day consideration process?
No, because I'm guessing there is no written. If there is, they're not going to tell us what it is, and I'm guessing it'll change with every minister, and that's a bit of a concern I have going forward. That a new minister may have a whole different set of evaluation criteria for deciding.
One is asking regarding the transition phase or period, I guess. The amendments indicate that all new road projects undertaken by the municipality will now be a Schedule C. We are in the process of a new road MCEA, which we were completing as a Schedule B. However, do we need to increase this to Schedule C, or should we carry on as a Schedule B until the ministry adopts the amendments?
Yeah, again, the phase-in provision says that if you're already started, it would continue as you have the option of continuing under the schedule you're under, or you can change to the new one. You have that option, so you might choose not to go with the new one in that instance.
So if you're planning on such a project, just make sure you start as early as possible on your MCEA so that you don't have to increase it to, you get a chance not to increase it to Schedule C, I guess, right?
Yeah, and I guess when you really though stop and think about it, schedule, the difference between the Schedule B and the Schedule C is that second public engagement that deals with the preferred alternative design.
Mm-hmm.
I really can't imagine a municipality that is going to build a new road and goes to the public and consults only on, well, we're going to have a new road here, but we're not going to bother consulting on you whether it'll have sidewalks or, you know, what kind of design details. You're going to do that anyway. So, like it might sound like you're elevating it from a B to a C. I just don't believe that you would ever undertake the minimum of B required anyway. So maybe combine your two public meetings at the same time and show them, yeah, we're going to put the road here and the design details are here. And so I don't think it's really going to be a big one way or the other.
And the last questions I see right now is, can your project be approved in less than 30 days?
Approved. I mean, the minister of the 30 days the minister has to review it.
I guess would you be able to know if you're going to receive comments from the ministry before 30 days?
I believe, yeah, the minister, they can write you, like if this was something so urgent that you couldn't wait the full 30 days, the minister could write you a letter saying, you know, on day 6, you could get a letter saying, I am not going to be issuing a notice or an order, therefore you're free to proceed. But the odds of getting that letter and not just waiting 30 days, you'd have to have some awful strong connections to the minister's office to make that happen, I would think.
And we have quite a few more questions also in the Q&A. Do you have time right now? Should we go through them or?
Sure, we've just got one more topic to cover. So.
Okay. Will there be a clarification on which schedule type of MCA will be needed regarding a municipality pre-owning or purchasing property? Specifically, we are about to purchase a property for a sanitary pump station and want to confirm whether it is a Schedule A or Schedule B.
Okay, the purchase of property is not covered in the Class EA, so it's always been an exempted activity. It's never been, you can just go, there's a process in the Municipal Act to follow when you're buying property, follow it. And it's got nothing to do with, there is no environmental approvals required, EA approvals.
All right, this is all. So thanks, Paul. Let's move forward. We'll take more, keep typing your questions in. We'll take them in the next question period.
Okay, this last one, I'm going to just give you a little update about it on air quality impact assessment. So the ministry has an expectation that these air quality impact assessments are an important part of the MCA process for major road, either new or expansion. And so as I understand it, this is not new. It's been going on for quite a number of years, particularly in the Toronto area. I think what's happened is the ministry has sort of geographically worked out, it's working out to more, I guess, rural areas. And so anyway, we're getting a whole bunch of questions. The ministry wants this air quality assessment. Why would I do that? And what is it? And why would I do that? So we've asked the ministry for some clarifications. And really, we're finding out ministry expects a pretty complex study that we're questioning the value of to the process. So I guess how we approach it, I asked the ministry, they sent a whole big long explanation of what should be modeling. So you look at the background data and then you model it, and look at the impacts on sensitive receivers. So they said, well, this is what's required. So I got some municipalities to send us copies of a study they've done, because I frankly had never seen one. And this particular one was in Hamilton, outside Hamilton. And when I read this case study one, this particular one, the predicted air quality was not considered to be significant when compared to air quality predicted for future no-build scenarios. So whether you proceeded with the project or not, there was really no difference. And this one, I guess there was a particular issue about it. Heavy truck volumes might increase. So they examined that in detail in the modeling. And they said that doubling the number, the volumes of heavy trucks would not have any significant impact on these sensitive receptors. Oh, well, so in that case, really it really had nothing. It wasn't a factor in choosing the preferred solution or in choosing the preferred design. The study didn't provide any information to contribute to or recommend any mitigating measures. It really, this detailed study demonstrated there was really no differences, no significant differences in whether you built the project or built it one way or the other. It really wasn't a factor. So I looked at a separate one. This is widening and improving the existing arterial road up to 6 lanes and putting in a new grade separation. And again, this road would have insignificant impacts on nearby receptors. So again, it was not a factor in the preferred solution and did not contribute any recommendations to mitigating measures. It really didn't provide anything useful. And the third one, this one in New York region, was basically the same. Mitigation measures are not warranted. And the conclusions are basically the same. So we started looking at this saying, well, so I understand what the ministry is asking for, and I see what people are doing, but I'm not seeing any value. So we sent this to the ministry and said, well, where's the value? What is it? What is it you're really looking for here? And they came back and gave us 4 examples of air quality of projects where there've been successful air quality assessment impact studies that we should look at. So I looked at them, which kind of surprised me because apparently they didn't look at them, because they came back with the very same information. The impact on overall air quality in the region is expected to be negligible. Was from another one in New York. So it didn't recommend any preference. It wasn't a factor in selecting the preferred solution or the preferred design, and didn't contribute or recommend any mitigating measures. One in Whitby, same thing. This one in Mississauga, same thing. And the 9th line in Mississauga again, same thing. So what I've consistently found is these studies apparently cost $35,000 each, and there seems to be, that we found so far, there's no evidence that they ever become a factor in choosing your preferred solution and preferred design. There's no examples that they contribute to or recommend mitigating measures. And they consistently demonstrate that there's no significant differences between any of the alternatives that are being considered. So, of course, we cannot support allocating time, funds, and effort unless the result adds value to the MCEA process. So I want to highlight that this is proposed because our discussions are continuing with the ministry. Something, the companion guide is MEA's recommendation. That part's clear, but we put our efforts into making sure that our recommendation is aligned with the ministry's expectations. And at the moment, so I've sent all this into the ministry, and you know, this is it's premature to say our advice aligns with their expectations. So we've asked them to adjust their expectations, and we have yet to. We're still working on that, so that's not done yet. But I guess something I would ask is those on the line, if you have experience with this and you have evidence that supports what we found so far, I'd be glad to hear from you. If you have evidence that doesn't, that you have examples where there has been great value to, you know, the air quality impact assessment has had an impact on your yearly process and developing successful mitigation measures, I'd love to hear about it. So I'll throw that back at all of you online. If you have anything to contribute, I'd appreciate that, because this is an ongoing issue. So instead, instead of requiring this checkbox of where's your air quality assessment study and you spend $35,000, we think that you should just rely on the data that's been developed over the years and just point to general statements to earlier studies have shown and clearly demonstrated that similar projects don't produce significant differences in air quality. So you address it in your ESR, but you don't do the study, you just refer to the in general terms. Instead, we would encourage that you stress things like that. Typical best practices such as dust control should be implemented during construction. Again, it's qualitative, or it's not a quantitative thing, but a qualitative thing. Streetscaping and trees around the project, you know, are going to, in some fashion, improve air quality. And wherever you can, use that as a mitigating measure. And I found a little sad that there didn't seem to be any air quality assessment mitigation. You spent your money all on the study. Well, why don't we put more effort into put some effort into a mitigation strategy with some plantings that would be helpful. So that would be our advice: is put your efforts into something that would actually do something instead of just creating a report with a checkbox beside it. So I just want to highlight here, going forward, we've had some webinars from last year here. We are planning, so whenever this approval comes from the ministry, in addition to getting the new manual produced and available to people, we'll be holding some webinars much like this on various topics. We'll be covering, I think there'll be a separate one on the approval of roads and wastewater projects through the Planning Act. That's complex enough that I think we've set aside a separate little session for it. Then we'll have a session just going through Appendix 1, the roads section, and reviewing all the changes. Same with water, wastewater, same with transit. And then to Part A of the document, that of course it covers the Part 2 other request process, but all the other changes to glossary and format, and just a lot of changes in there. And then when something further happens on the project list and or the new regulation, we would commit to getting back to you with more information whenever that happens. So I really hope before Christmas we're doing the first 5 up there, and project lesson rule regulation, as hope is somewhat delayed. And we have a course coming up here in October, but I guess registration is open. So you're welcome to join us for those 3 afternoons where we go through the process. And as I said, we'll be going through the details of the Class EA process. And you might think, well, I better wait until I have the new regulations in place. Well, I think that's going to be some time. And I also think when it does happen, as I said earlier, I think the changes are going to be, okay, the notice is now called this instead of this, and this time frame applies, but the basic philosophy and strategy is not likely to change. So I guess that's what we try and cover in this course. So that's all I got today, and leave that for some more questions.
Thank you, Paul. Let me pull up the questions. Okay. If the ministry has no or minor comments on a project until they issue a formal that can proceed.
Sorry, man, that didn't come through too well to me.
Oh, seems that my internet connection is a bit unstable. If the question is asking if the ministry has no comments or minor comments on a project, can the project proceed until a formal letter advising? I'll just ask the person who asked the question to please rephrase it, because I'm having trouble understanding it. I'll move to the next question. Under new MCEA amendment doc, does the S16, the new way of doing the Part 2 order and approval process, apply to master plans when completed to phase 2?
Well, yeah, master plans, if you're carrying through on, now I forget which, there's different ways you can do them. But if you're going with a notice of completion for those Schedule B projects, then yes, it would apply. So anytime there's a notice of completion, the process applies. And I think that first question, if what you were asking is, do you need a letter from the ministry saying you can proceed? No, it's a self-assessment process. You issue a notice of completion, wait 30 days, and that's for the public, the stakeholders. Then there's another 30 days, and if there's no communication from the ministry by day 60, then you approve to proceed. There's no requirement to wait for a letter.
Mm-hmm. Does the air quality assessment conclusion apply to roadworks only, or have you also assessed the impacts to other types of projects, such as water, wastewater, biosolids handling, etc.?
Yeah, we really just looked at road projects. I mean, we would agree on a wastewater project that has a point source emission, pumping station, sewage plant, biosolids. An air quality assessment would be very valuable and necessary. Now, it might be more appropriate at the detailed design stage. So in the EA, you may just reference it and talk about that it will be done, but I think it's maybe more likely at the detailed design when you have more information to make the study accurate. But we were focusing particularly on road projects. Are you muted, Emaine?
Thank you, Paul. Those are all the questions that I see so far.
Okay.
So just to remind everyone, if you'd like to access any of the recording of our previous webinars, you can do so by going to municipalengineers.on.ca and click on resources, navigate to webinars, and you will find an archive of all our previous webinars.
And you'll notice on the, I guess I stopped sharing my screen, but I can share it back up with it. There's a feature, there's an email address where you can, it's called Ask an Expert, that you can email us. And it isn't just me, there's a committee that we can also access. So yeah, you're free to ask questions anytime, I suppose.
Absolutely. All right, with that, we'd like to thank you, Paul, for your time and for sharing your expertise on this topic. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And we'll hopefully see everybody back soon where we're talking about the approved amendment and the details. So we'll see.
So, thanks. Good day.